Well, hello everybody. I'm Thelma Walker, MP for Combe Valley in West Yorkshire. And after an historic week in Parliament and for our country, it's great to be here and to welcome everybody to Hastings, and specifically to the wonderful St Mary's in the Castle Theatre. What an amazing building. This is one of the closest marginal seats in the country. In the excitement of the 2017 general election, Labour came within a whisker of winning here. Hastings and Rye, a constituency considered a relatively safe seat for the then Home Secretary, Amber Rudd. But on polling night, only 340 votes out of over 50,000 stood between the Tories and Labour here. Unbelievable and great. On that night, I won my seat, Combe Valley, taking it from the Conservative Party by almost 1,000 votes. You see, I'm still smiling, We need just a 0.3% swing to Labour to win Hastings, and we're up for the fight, aren't we? Yeah. I hope we can take Hastings and more seats from this failing Tory government very soon in a general election, which we need to break the deadlock in Parliament. Because places like Hastings deserve better. In so many ways, Hastings is a community which has been held back by this Conservative government. Take education. As a former head teacher, this is a subject very close to my heart. There has been dismay amongst parents and teachers alike in Hastings because of ongoing pressures and what is seen locally as a process of academisation of good schools for the benefit of profit. Last year, teachers at Helenswood Academy took strike action over the issue, a last resort for any teacher. Labour is against the Tories' pet project of academies. We will introduce a national education service and fund our schools properly so that all children, regardless of background, receive a world-class education. Just one of the many transformative policies from our manifesto. Hastings has a slightly higher than average leave vote, with 55% voting to leave here. But the problems that the people of Hastings face are the same as those faced by communities across the UK, regardless of the way those communities voted in the referendum. Like so many parts of the country, Hastings has suffered cuts to local council budgets, a rise in food bank use, and Hastings has one of the highest rates of personal insolvencies in England and Wales. This is disgraceful when we live in the 6th richest country in the world. Labour's mission is to bring people together, to unite the divisions that the Brexit referendum started and the Conservative government exacerbated. And to do that, we need a new government. Not only a government that will have the majority it needs to negotiate the jobs-first Brexit deal our country needs, but a democratic, socialist government with direction and purpose, a government with an inspirational leader who will rebuild our country for the many, not the few. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce the man who can deliver that ambition. Ladies and gentlemen, the leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn.
Thanks so much.
Welcome back.
Lovely to see you, and well, fantastic. And you're going to be the one to deliver it in Hastings.
Yeah. Definitely.
Fantastic. And thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thank you.
Like the beard. Thank you. Could I say thank you all for being here today? It's really great to be in this wonderful theatre, which I've been in before, and is such a great place and in such a great town. And I thank Thelma for coming today to introduce the event. Thelma won her seat in Colne Valley in the general election, and we had an incredible rally on a beautiful summer's evening in a park, and it was just that buzz and that atmosphere that she'd inspired, because a real head teacher doesn't threaten, a real head teacher inspires their students, and that's exactly what Thelma does in her constituency and in Parliament. And so we've got a head teacher chairing the event, so anybody that gets a bit unruly, she'll talk to you quietly and privately afterwards and sort it out. And I want to also say it's great to be here alongside my great friend Pete Chowney, our candidate, and is going to be our MP for Hastings. Pete, as our candidate, took it so close. Pete, as our candidate, is also the leader of the council. Pete really is actually Mr. Hastings. Well done, Pete. And his concern and his determination to turn this town around so that the levels of poverty that do disfigure so many South Coast towns will be dealt with, that the sense of hopelessness that so many face when they see towns declining because of lack of investment, underfunding of their local services by central government, and a whole process of threats to local services such as the National Health Service have got to be stopped, challenged and changed. And it's Labour that will stop, challenge and change the way in which so many of our South Coast towns are affected. And this, of course, is the town that inspired the writing of The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropist. And Mugsborough, as it's described there, was about the inequality and injustice within our society then and now, and the way in which those building workers were exploited, the way in which the poor were ignored, that social segregation that was there in the town. That's what inspired Robert Tressel Noonan to write his wonderful book. It's a book that inspired me and inspired generations of people to look at the world differently, from a perspective that brings about social justice, that brings about equality, that brings about hope for all. It's called socialism. And I would like to thank and welcome my colleagues here today who've come. Diane Abbott, our Shadow Home Secretary, who actually, I think, was quite looking forward to debates with Amber Rudd, but she's gone on to do something else, and I'll deal with universal credit a bit later on. But Diane is doing a fantastic job in bringing humanity to the whole principles behind the Home Affairs brief and promoting justice and equality. And you'll hear lots from her tonight when she's on BBC Question Time. Diane, thank you and thanks for coming. And Richard Bergen, our Shadow Secretary of State for Justice, is also here today, who is taking the issue of justice reform and prison reform and justice to our society straight out there to the public and in that debate, and he's doing an incredible job around the Shadow Cabinet table. Richard, thank you very much for everything that you do. Yesterday, the Prime Minister suffered the most devastating defeat in Parliament on the most important issue facing our country. The central policy of her government has been decisively rejected. The defeat that she suffered in the vote on the European Union agreement that she had reached was the biggest ever defeat any government has ever faced in British political history. Think about that, the biggest ever defeat on a central plank of it. It's clear that her EU deal is now finished. There can be no question of tweaks or sweeteners from Brussels to bring it back to life. The deal that she brought back, all the 500 plus pages of it, is quite clearly a dead deal. She put it to Parliament and it was emphatically rejected. And we now have to realise that the Prime Minister seems completely unable to grasp what has actually happened. She seems to be prepared to send the country hurtling towards a cliff edge. To get a deal that can command a majority in Parliament, Theresa May has to ditch the red lines and get serious about proposals for the future. Last night's offer of talks with party leaders turned out to be simply a stunt, not a serious attempt to engage with a new reality that is needed. No sooner had she said the words in Parliament than the government confirmed that she would not take no deal off the table. So I say to the Prime Minister again, I'm quite happy to talk, but the starting point for any talks about Brexit must be that the threat of a disastrous no-deal outcome is ruled out, taken off the table, and we can talk about the future of the plans that we will put forward and the future relationship with Europe. But take no deal off the table now, please, Prime Minister. And if she won't accept the will of Parliament to take no deal off the table, it will show that she simply isn't serious about reaching a deal. With no deal on the table, the Prime Minister would enter into phony talks just to run down the clock and try to blackmail MPs to vote through her botched deal on a second attempt by threatening the country with the chaos that no deal would bring if they resist her entreaties to support her deal a second time. Instead, Theresa May should show us that she's serious about getting a deal that Parliament supports and that brings the country together by immediately ending the waste of hundreds of millions of pounds of public money preparing for a no-deal outcome which simply cannot take place. The government has set aside £4.8 billion to prepare for no deal. There's so many better things that money could be spent on. Instead, could support our cash-starved public services. 4.8 billion would pay for every 2 to 4-year-old to get free nursery education for a year. 4.8 billion would help the crisis of social care and funding in our NHS. 4.8 billion would help the crisis of rough sleeping homelessness. 4.8 billion could do so much for youth services and young people around our country, but no, the government is prepared to spend 4.8 billion of our money on preparing for a no-deal Brexit in order to try and threaten MPs into voting for her deal, which has already been declared bankrupt by Parliament itself. Prime Minister, take it off the table and have a serious discussion about how we approach the future. No deal would risk huge damage to our economy, jobs and living standards. About that, there is no doubt. So Labour is open to discussions because we must end the crisis caused by the government's botched Brexit negotiations and find a solution that meets the needs of the whole country. We, the Labour Party, have set out an alternative plan, and I've made clear we would support a deal on that basis. The government may have survived a confidence vote for now, but we have a government in name only. The scale of the defeat on Tuesday has shredded the last vestiges of its authority. If the government had any confidence in itself, it would go back to the people for a new mandate. While Brexit consumes all the government's energy, the vital issues that affect people most directly, cash-starved schools, the NHS at breaking point, rising bills, unaffordable houses, have all gone to the back of the queue. 2.5 years of Brexit bungling and failure have left Parliament in deadlock. Nothing can be decided, nothing can get done. We believe that the best outcome for this crisis, for the country as a whole, remains calling a general election to break the deadlock and find a solution that works for the whole country. And that is why I tabled a motion of no confidence last night, and I thank all those colleagues that supported the motion of no confidence last night. And we will come back on it again if necessary, because we are determined to deal with the issues facing this country and also give the people a choice of who their MPs should be and who their government should be, whether they have one that stands up for them or one that shows the degree of incompetence that this government has shown. But in the meantime, all options are on the table. We're serious about finding a way through. Given the severity of the crisis, it would be wrong to rule any of them out. Our first option is the alternative plan we've laid out over the past year. Labour will put down its own amendment to the proposals next week, setting out our alternative plan, based around a permanent customs union with the European Union, a strong single market relationship, and a guarantee at least to keep pace with all EU rights at work, environmental protections and consumer standards. We will not take part or allow this country to become part of a race to the bottom in which the poorest, the most vulnerable lose out in order to appease the very richest and the biggest corporations in the world. No. We want to see a protection for the most vulnerable within our society. Those three elements provide the essential building blocks of a sensible deal, with a clear potential to win the majority support in Parliament. And I believe such a deal would help to bring people together and overcome the divisions in our country. But if the government remains intransigent, if support for Labour's alternative is blocked for party advantage, and the country is facing the potential disaster of no deal, our duty will then be to look at other options which we've set out in our conference motion, including that of a public vote. We are in this position because the Conservatives and other parties have deliberately chosen to deepen divisions, setting those who voted leave against those who voted to remain. People voted leave, people voted remain. But we're the party that has consistently sought to bring people together to find a way through that respects people's concern, whichever way they voted in the referendum. Because I believe the real divide in our country is not between Leave and Remain voters. It's between the many who do the work, create the wealth, pay their taxes, work in our society, work in our hospitals, work in our schools, work in our factories, deliver the economy and the living standards for the rest of us. And those others, those few who break the rules, who dodge their taxes, who run away and don't support our society and our economy. It's between the many and the few. Labour set out in our manifesto in 2017 the plans we have for an investment-led economy, for good jobs, for a higher basic wage, for an investment in education, in housing and health, and all those issues. We set all that out because we believe that's the direction in which the majority of people in this country want to go. But on Tuesday, while the country's attention was fixed on Westminster and the vote that took place, and it was a dramatic day in Parliament. I'd never seen such chaos in any government, and I've been in Parliament 35 years, and I've seen plenty of chaos in government, but that was the worst by a long way. We had yet another demonstration of the harsh reality of what this government is about. The Department of Work and Pensions, and the MP for Hastings and Rye is indeed the Secretary of State for the Department of Work and Pensions, quietly decided to announce another cut to social security, which, according to analysis done by Age UK, could leave some couples up to £7,000 a year worse off. Their latest cut will force yet more people onto the government's cruel universal credit scheme. Couples in which one spouse is a pensioner will no longer be entitled to pension credit. So just imagine this. If you've paid into the system all your life and you've retired on a low income, and now the government decides you'll be poorer just because your partner is younger than you. That's disgraceful, that's wrong, and that was announced on Tuesday while the rest of the nation was watching Parliament and what was going on there. How typical of the Tories, how typical of Amber Rudd. Whether they voted Leave or Remain, people want an end to these injustices. Remember, the vast, vast majority of people don't think of themselves as Remainers or Leavers. However, they're regarded by the media as somehow or other a political class that's got to be negotiated around. If we allow ourselves to be permanently divided on these artificial lines, it's only the privileged elite that will benefit, while the majority lose out. So, our message to the government is, you've lost your vote in Parliament. You survived yesterday on the loyalty, the rather thin loyalty of Tory MPs. And we are determined to get a deal with the European Union, which, as I've explained, sets out the three pillars that we will put forward. We are sensible, we're serious, and we're positive about this. But our entire focus as a party is on the reality of people's lives in this country. The poverty, the insecurity, the lack of investment, the concerns and fears for the future. Bring people together to create that better society and that better world. Have that relationship with Europe that gives us the customs union, gives us the trade, protects the rights. Have that relationship that is positive, that is open. I want to live in a country that doesn't rely on food banks, that doesn't rely on payday loans, that doesn't rely on loan sharks. I want to live in a country where people feel engaged, enthused, and positive for the future. That is the Labour way, and that will be the forefront of our minds during the next few weeks of crucial debate and voting in Parliament. Deliver a society that works for all, not just the few. Thank you very much. Okay. If you move down there.
You want to take 3 of these questions together or
Yes,
one at a time?
three, yeah.
Well, there speaks our future Prime Minister. We're going to move into the Q&A now, and we're going to speak to the media, give the media a chance to ask questions first, but don't worry, we will be taking questions from the audience. Do we have Helen Catt from the BBC? Helen, have you got a question for us?
If you were to go into a new general election, obviously Hastings is 55% leave vote here. Do you still envisage it being Labour policy if one were to happen before we leave the EU, that it would still be Labour policy that you would be leaving?
Okay, thank you, Helen. And ITV, Angus Walker.
Much. Mr. Corbyn, as leader of Her Majesty's opposition, surely at a time of national crisis, if the Prime Minister says, "Come and talk to me," you go and at least hear what she has to say, or is the risk that you end up with her looking reasonable and you being portrayed as a wrecker?
Okay, all right, okay. And Sky News. Sky? Okay. The mic over here.
Sky News. Lewis Goodall, Sky News. Got to. Mr. Corbyn, there will be an attempt next week by some parliamentarians to shift our exit date to the end of this year, thereby extending Article 50. What is your position on that? Will you be whipping your MPs to do that? Has the time come to be straight with the British people and just say, actually, it's just not going to be possible to negotiate a new deal or any deal in the time remaining?
Okay. Thanks for those questions. The Prime Minister offered talks last night in Parliament, and I said quite clearly that Labour has the alternative, the 3 pillars that I pointed out, of the customs union, market access and protection of rights and conditions within our society. But The process of the last month has been one of threatening people by saying, well, if you don't vote for this deal, then it's no deal, and it's going to be the crisis of no deal. I just said, quite simply, I'm happy to put forward our views on it, but you've got to take no deal off the table first. And I have to say, I think that's an entirely reasonable position. I did meet the Prime Minister in early December. I did discuss with her the parliamentary process, and we agreed there would be 5 days of debate and there would be a vote on December the 11th. 2 days before that, she changed her mind, cancelled the vote, and delayed things for over a month in order to continue this idea of running down the clock by threatening everyone with no deal unless they voted for her deal. Well, it didn't work because she ended up with the biggest ever defeat in British political history. And so I'm more than happy to put forward Labour's points of view, and indeed we will be doing that next week in Parliament. We will be putting forward our amendments, which will be around the issues that I've already referred to. And if we succeed in getting a general election, then obviously we will put to the people our views on this, our views on the kind of relationship we could have with Europe in the future. But I have to say, Labour is a very large, very open and very democratic party. Our policy going into the general election, our manifesto, will not be decided by me alone. I'll be one person in the room that will be deciding what goes in that manifesto. There will be many, many others there. And so our general election strategy will be that. But I think I've made it very clear the principles that we adopt, which is about the kind of society we want to live in, is about that relationship with Europe as a very minimal. But I've also said, made it very clear, that all the options are on the table, including the public vote option, which we made clear in our conference motion, which was, I have to remind you, unanimously agreed by our conference last September in Liverpool. And on the question of the exit date, quite clearly, if no agreement has been reached within time that it could be implemented by the end of March, then obviously the issue of extending the exit date, of extending Article 50, does come into play, and indications are that may well be the case coming up after April. But our principles are, our views are there, we're prepared to negotiate. The Labour Party is in Parliament in order to try to defend people against the crisis that would be created by a no-deal Brexit, but also to put forward a positive relationship with the European Union in the future. That is what we've said all the way through this process. And I just have to say this, without the work of Labour MPs and those people that were prepared to go to court on it, and particularly the forensic work done by Keir Starmer on this, we would not have had the meaningful vote in Parliament, because the government introduced this whole process with a bill which I described yesterday in Parliament as one that Henry VIII would have been proud of, because what it did was actually empowered, I can't remember which Secretary of State for Brexit it was, because there's been so many of them, to decide everything, basically, and Parliament would just be a sort of bystander in this. Well, things have changed. Parliament rejected the idea of the Brexit deal Theresa May had negotiated, rejected the no-deal exit, and has ensured that Parliament will have a big say in what goes on over the next few weeks. That only happened because the Labour Party was standing up for the rights of democratically elected representatives to speak for them in Parliament and hold government to account. And I say that as somebody who obviously aspires to be in government, therefore to be Prime Minister. I would welcome being held to account by Parliament. I would not be running away from Parliament. I would want to be held to account for it.
Thank you, Jeremy. We'll have two more questions from the media. Have we got a European broadcaster here? Euronews? Are you? Yep.
Jeremy, you got a decent round of applause here when you mentioned the party policy on the second referendum. A poll out today has the biggest support for Remain, 12% since the referendum in 2016. People here in the room seem to like that. What would be your position if there was a second referendum or a general election as you want on staying in?
Okay. And Channel 5, we've got Andy Bell here.
Thanks. Andy Bell, 5 News. Mr. Corbyn, you say you won't be meeting Theresa May. Is that a complete ban also for your shadow cabinet on meeting anyone from the government? And what would happen to any Labour MPs? What would happen to any Labour MPs if they were to respond to an invitation from the Prime Minister to go and talk to her?
Okay.
What was the last bit, Andy?
What would happen to any Labour MPs, in your view, what should happen if they were to respond to the invitation and go and speak to the Prime Minister?
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. We'll move to the audience now. We're taking the questions in 3, so one question from the audience for now, and then there'll be some more. Yeah, should we do them together? Yeah, okay. Yes, woman at the front here. Yeah, okay.
Yes, the last question raises this. Is it time that we challenge the people who are calling for a people's vote or a new referendum to say what the questions will be? And that it's not just for the Prime Minister to take no deal off the table, but for that to be excluded from any questions, that we don't want a rerun of the referendum, which will give a huge platform to UKIP. What we want is a choice between the remaining options. And can we do that publicly? Because they have been so getting at you, which is why nobody that's a Labour loyalist is listening to them at all. But they are hugely influential through the press.
Okay, thank you very much. Jeremy?
I've made it clear that the question of another referendum is on the table. It's there from our conference motion, and we're running through a sequence of events, the first of which was to vote against Theresa May's deal and vote it down, and that has already happened. The second was that in the event of her not being able to get support for her deal, we believe the best outcome is a general election. I still believe that to be the best outcome, and while she survived the motion of no confidence yesterday, quite honestly, this is a government that hardly puts any legislation to Parliament, has hardly done any legislation since the election of 2017, doesn't have a majority, and it's supposed to have a confidence and supply arrangement with the DUP. Well, the confidence evaporated and the supply disappeared and only came back temporarily for the motion of no confidence yesterday. This isn't credible. This isn't a serious way of going on. So my view is there has to be a general election. If a second referendum should take place, then obviously the party will decide what role we will play in that and what our view would be. But I can't really go along with the idea it should simply be a rerun of what happened in 2016. There has to be a discussion about the options that we've put forward, and we've put forward the 3 options that I've outlined in my speech to you. On the question of meetings, and thanks for your question, Andy, I've made it clear that I'm more than happy to put forward our views and meet to discuss them. And indeed, I have spent probably more time than any other Labour leader in travelling in and around Europe and meeting the Party of European Socialists, the European Commission, the European Parliament and national governments all across Europe. I'm very serious about a relationship with people across Europe, those that are opposing austerity, those that are suffering from austerity, and I'm also very, very clear it's important to stand alongside people all across Europe who are standing up against the frightening rise of racism, far-right activity and xenophobia across Europe. And so when the European Parliament voted to condemn what was going on in Hungary, I absolutely applauded them for doing that. Now, if other colleagues take a different view, well, I can understand that. What I've done is written to the Prime Minister this morning, setting out the views that I put in my contribution today, and copied that to all Labour MPs. And yesterday, the whole Labour Party was together. On Tuesday night, the Labour Party was together. The Labour Party is determined to deliver for the people of this country. That is our whole approach to it, and I'm sure that all the party will be supportive of that. This is a huge moment for this country. Therefore, we have to approach it on the principles that I've set out, the principles of the kind of society we want to live in. That's what the Labour way is about, and that's the view we'll be putting to Parliament, whether directly in the Chamber or in meetings if the Prime Minister actually concedes that a no-deal Brexit is actually the most dangerous and very damaging thing to our country and our society. So I say to the Prime Minister again, she may even be listening, Prime Minister, simply do this. Take it off the table. Take it off the table now so we can go forward in a sensible way.
Okay. So we move to the audience and the good people of Hastings, and 3 questions from the audience now. Gentleman here, yeah, we got a mic?
As far as say gentlemen, but thank you very much for that. I'm from Eastbourne, as is my wife, and my question is an overall question about what can the Labour Party do to increase support in seats where they're lagging behind. Unfortunately, we have a choice between Tory and Lib Dem in Eastbourne, and it's always a battle between the two. Would Labour support a move towards a proportional representation system where you can vote with your heart rather than with your head?
Okay, thank you. Further question? The woman at the front here.
This might annoy a few people here, but I wondered how we can go about countering the division that seems to be stoked by the mainstream media, who are forcing us into a leave camp and remain camp, rather than looking at the nuanced argument in between.
Thank you. And the gentleman right at the back, over there. Yeah.
Hiya, thank you. We have a lot of polarisation and hatred in politics these days, and I wanted to ask who we have here today, what do we think about the real threat? Is there a real threat of violence and vigilante action in our society today?
Okay, thank you. Vigilante society. Okay. Swap over.
Thanks for the questions, and welcome from Eastbourne. I've cycled Eastbourne to here and all over to Rye and Pevensey Levels and everything. And do you know what? People living in Eastbourne who are struggling with universal credit, with pensions, with housing, with rent and so on, having exactly the same problems as people suffering from the same things in Hastings or in Hackney or in Birmingham. The issues are the way in which our government treats our society. And Labour fought the last election to bring people together, and we had the biggest increase in the Labour vote since 1945 during an election campaign. And I'm bitterly sad we didn't quite win that election campaign. But I opened the campaign by saying, this is our manifesto. This is our proposal to transform our society. We're not doing deals with other parties. We're putting our case before the people, and they will vote for us or not, as the case may be. You make the point about Eastbourne. Eastbourne has had, and now has, Lib Dem MPs. The Lib Dems actually got into bed with the Tories, supported austerity, and ended up with a 300% increase in student fees and the austerity and all that went with it. In previous elections, the Labour Party was third in Southport. Some people said, well, no point. Let's give up. Let's go away. Let somebody else do it. Labour campaigned in Southport, and we came within a whisker of winning Southport from third place. That is what Labour can achieve when we work hard and campaign together. So please stick at it. The questions of division and polarisation within our society are very, very serious ones indeed. We saw a whiff of it last week outside Parliament when Anna Soubry, Conservative MP, and Owen Jones were both abused and attacked and called all sorts of awful things. Some MPs get a great deal of abuse, and nobody has been more abused and more badly treated than my friend Diane Abbott in her work as MP and as Shadow Home Secretary. And she has had to withstand the most awful misogynist and racist abuse all of her political life. But she's strong. She comes through this and makes the point that she takes it because she doesn't want anybody else to have to take it. And so it is about the language we use. It is also about the intolerance that is there on the far right and on the racist fringes of our society. We saw some awful things happening just after the last referendum. I don't want to see any more of that. I don't want any anti-Semitism. I don't want any Islamophobia. I don't want any far-right racism within our society. We have to come together as a society and a community. And when you raise the question of insecurity and the idea of vigilantism, well, vigilantism doesn't solve anything. What does deal with the issues of security within our society are bringing people together and having a sense of hope, having a police force that's adequately funded and is active and there on the streets, but 20,000 police officers are no longer on the streets. And it was the last Labour government that introduced community policing, PCSOs, which I think have been a safer neighbourhood strategy, I think has been a very good one. But the way to reduce crime is a combination of things, including better quality of life for people, including decent housing, including real hope for young people. And so our Labour offer goes far beyond just the specifics of what we're going to say, of how many police officers we're going to put here, how many probation officers, and all that. It's also what we do in our education system, what we do to ensure that young people in school do come together and have some sense of hope for the future. I'm deeply concerned about the number of young people that are being excluded from school, that are being put into special units, that therefore are unlikely to achieve very much in their remaining time in that secondary school, and then not likely to achieve much more within our society. Never give up on anybody, never give up particularly on young people. Thelma, as a former head teacher, is somebody that articulates this really well. And so a Labour offer will be about a national education service, education being changed into a right, not a commodity. And the legacy of the next Labour government, as the Attlee government of 45 to 51, their great legacy is the National Health Service. The legacy of the next Labour government will be a national education service which will give free education from cradle to grave as a human right for all of us.
Well, thank you for your questions, one and all, and thank you for making us so welcome here in Hastings. I'd certainly intend to come back and have a holiday here soon. Okay, and we're off to the hospital, is that right?
We're campaigning with you all in the hospital.
Yeah, okay. And just before we finish, I'd like to say that when we won the seat in Combe Valley, I was asked the night of the election, when it was announced that we had won the seat, was it a surprise? And I'm not an arrogant person, but actually it wasn't to me, because a few weeks after Jeremy's visit and when we've been door knocking, a few weeks before, I felt a mood within our constituency. I felt a spirit. And I feel that now across our country. I feel that spirit, that need for change. And just as I felt in Combe Valley, I feel you're going to have a Labour MP in Hastings. Thank you.
Thanks, mate. That's it. Thank you very much. See you soon. Thanks, guys. Thank you. Thanks a lot. We're on our way now. We go now. Thank you very much, everybody.